In February of 1942, 15,000 Australian soldiers marched into captivity. Not in the chaotic scramble that myths would later suggest, but in organized battalions under the open sky, their rifles slung over shoulders, moving toward detention camps that would hold them for the next 3.5 years. What made this moment historically singular was not that soldiers were captured in war. Soldiers are captured in wars. What made this moment matter was that these men were marched into captivity while their command structure was still intact, while ammunition remained in stores, while the fighting was mathematically not yet over. They were surrendered by authority at a moment when authority still held the power to decide their fate. They were not overrun. They were ordered to stop fighting. And the question that shaped the rest of their lives and shaped Australian military thinking for decades to come was simple and unanswerable. Why? The fall of Singapore represents something more complex than military defeat. It represents the moment when an entire strategic worldview was revealed as fundamentally miscalculated. It is the moment when an empire discovered that its assumptions about geography, technology, and enemy intention had been catastrophically wrong. And it is the moment when 15,000 Australians discovered that the fortress they had been sent to defend did not exist as anything but an idea in the minds of commanders who had never visited it. Singapore was supposed to be impregnable. That was not aspiration. That was official doctrine. The guns that defended it were the most powerful in the Southern Hemisphere. The garrison was being reinforced daily. The fortress was so strong that Japan would never dare attack it. This was what the young men who arrived in Singapore in 1941 believed, because this is what they had been told by their government, by their commanders, by military planners in London and Canberra who had studied strategy and geography and come to the conclusion that Singapore was the secure foundation upon which British power in the Far East would stand indefinitely. None of this was true, and within weeks of arriving, the soldiers would discover that they had walked into a trap. The trap had not been set by the Japanese alone. It had been constructed by months of miscalculation, by strategic doctrine that could not adapt to reality, by commanders who transmitted orders that contradicted what their eyes could see, and by a British Empire whose promises of protection had been revealed as hollow at the exact moment when those promises would be tested. This is the story of how that happened. It is also the story of how one general made a choice in the darkness that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and how 15,000 ordinary soldiers paid the price for decisions that had been made months before they ever set foot on Singapore's shores. The winter of 1940, in terms of British strategic planning, was a moment of careful equilibrium. Japan had invaded China nearly 3 years earlier and showed no sign of withdrawal. Thailand was wavering in its neutrality. The Netherlands East Indies, with their vast reserves of rubber and oil, seemed increasingly vulnerable to Japanese expansion. But Britain was not at war with Japan. Britain was fighting Germany, and that war was consuming virtually every resource available. The question that occupied British military planners was not whether Japan would become a threat, but when. And the assumption was that when Japan did move, it would move toward the rubber and oil fields to the southwest, down through Malaya toward the Dutch colonies, seeking resources rather than territory in a broader sense. Singapore was the linchpin in the entire strategy of defending these territories. The fortress sat at the southern tip of Malaya, controlling the Strait of Malacca, the primary shipping route through which Japan would have to pass to reach the resource-rich territories beyond. If Singapore held, Japanese expansion could be contained or at least significantly delayed. If Singapore fell, Japanese power would radiate across the entire Far East with nothing to contain it. This is why, starting in 1935, Britain invested heavily in fortifying Singapore. Guns were installed, concrete was poured, walls were raised, but the guns, as it turned out, all pointed south. The assumption was that invasion would come by sea, from the direction the Japanese would logically approach. Japanese forces would have to sail down from the north, through the Malacca Strait. Therefore, the fortress was designed to defend against a naval assault from that direction. What no one in the planning process adequately considered was that Japanese tactical doctrine did not follow British assumptions about what was logical. Japan had been fighting in China for years. Japanese commanders had learned that conventional wisdom about terrain could be violated. Impassable jungles could be traversed if soldiers were willing to move fast and live on minimal supplies. Mountains that European military strategists considered barriers could be crossed. The Japanese had developed an entire approach to warfare based on moving through terrain that was assumed to be impassable and defeating enemies that assumed they were safe because of geography. When Japanese planners looked at the conquest of Malaya and Singapore, they did not see a sea invasion. They saw the opportunity to move rapidly down the Malayan Peninsula from Thailand through terrain the British had dismissed as militarily irrelevant and attack the fortress from behind. This was not a secret. Japanese intentions were made clear in the diplomatic tensions and intelligence reports of 1941. But even as this intelligence arrived in London and Canberra, the strategic doctrine did not shift. Singapore was designed to hold. Therefore, it would hold. The fortress, by definition of being a fortress, had to be able to resist. By 1941, the tension between Japanese expansion and British interests had reached a critical point. Japan was moving deeper into China. Japanese forces were moving toward Thailand. The question was not if Japan would attack the British territories, but when, and whether Britain could assemble sufficient forces to defend them. Australia was drawn into this calculation as a junior but valuable partner. Australian forces had proven themselves in North Africa against German and Italian armies. Australian commanders had demonstrated competence and aggression, and Australia itself was geographically positioned as the ultimate stake in any Japanese expansion toward the south. If Japan took the Indies and Malaya and Singapore, Australia would be next. Therefore, Australia had a fundamental interest in defending these territories. In the middle of 1941, the Australian military leadership made the decision to reinforce Singapore with additional forces. The 22nd Australian Brigade, a relatively fresh unit, was ordered to the fortress. Then 23rd Brigade followed. Then supporting forces, artillery, engineers. By December 1941, there were 15,000 Australian soldiers in Singapore, integrated into a garrison that also included British forces, Indian forces, and local troops. They were supposed to be reinforcements in a fortress that was supposed to be holding indefinitely, while the war in Europe was resolved. No one was supposed to be seriously concerned about the security of Singapore. It was a fortress. Fortresses held. This is what fortresses did. The men who arrived in Singapore in the autumn of 1941 were young, mostly in their 20s, many of them conscripts who had been in uniform for barely a year. They came from towns and farms and cities across Australia with varying degrees of enthusiasm for being posted to a distant fortress in a part of the world they barely understood. They carried equipment that was often inadequate for tropical conditions. They carried assumptions about their role based on training that had not prepared them for what was about to happen. They were soldiers of a democracy that believed itself to be secure and defended by the most powerful empire the world had ever known. They believed they were reinforcing a fortress. They were actually walking into a mathematical trap that would close behind them in a matter of days. The strategic situation in the Far East deteriorated rapidly in the weeks before the Japanese attack began. Japanese forces were consolidating positions along the Thai border. Japanese diplomats were making final arrangements with the Thai government. Japanese aircraft were moving into position. British military intelligence was reporting all of this clearly. What remained unclear was the exact timing and exact location of the attack. Would it be Thailand first and then Malaya? Would it be a land invasion or an attempted amphibious operation? Would the focus be on Singapore directly or on the resource fields to the south? The answers to these questions were not obvious to the commanders on the ground, even though, in retrospect, the Japanese intentions seem clear. Japan would enter Thailand, establish a base of operations, advance down the Malayan Peninsula at maximum speed, and attack Singapore from the direction that was least defended. This advance down Malaya, when it came, moved faster than British military planners believed possible. Japanese forces did not stop to consolidate territory. They did not establish secure supply lines in the conventional sense. They moved fast, lived on minimal supplies, and kept advancing. British forces attempted to establish defensive lines. Defensive lines were broken. British forces attempted to fall back and established new defensive lines. New defensive lines were broken. Within 2 weeks, Japanese forces had advanced nearly the entire length of the Malayan Peninsula. Within 3 weeks, they were at the Strait of Johor, the narrow body of water that separated Malaya from Singapore. The fortress that was supposed to hold indefinitely was now facing an enemy that had moved faster than anyone thought possible and had arrived at its gate still possessing the majority of its fighting power. The command structure in Singapore during these final weeks of December 1941 was a complex hierarchy of British authority, with Australian forces integrated beneath it. The overall commander was a British general. The Australian forces were under the command of Major General Henry Gordon Bennett, an officer of considerable experience and considerable ego. Bennett had fought in the First World War. He had commanded Australian forces since the 1930s. He was respected and, in some circles, feared. He was also a man who understood that his career was being shaped by the decisions he made in the coming days. The fortress was failing. The advance down Malaya was not being halted. Japanese forces were approaching at a speed that made the very concept of defense seem almost academic. And Bennett, as the senior Australian officer, was being asked to participate in a command structure that was increasingly giving orders that had no relationship to military reality. By the beginning of January 1942, the situation had become clear enough that even official optimism could not obscure it. Japanese forces controlled most of Malaya. They were establishing artillery positions on the northern shore of the Strait of Johor. They were preparing for an assault on Singapore itself. The question was no longer whether Singapore would be attacked, but when. The question was what the fortress could actually accomplish when that attack came. And here is where the strategic miscalculation that had shaped every decision since 1935 became relevant in the most immediate sense. The guns of Singapore, designed and positioned to defend against a naval invasion from the south, were mostly useless against an enemy that was attacking from the land to the north. Some guns could be turned to face the new direction, but the fortress had been designed with the assumption that the primary threat came from the sea. That assumption was wrong. The weeks from the Japanese breakthrough in Malaya to the assault on Singapore proper represented a compressed crucible in which the decisions and assumptions of years were tested against reality and found wanting. British forces were withdrawing into Singapore. Australian forces were falling back into the fortress perimeter. Orders were being issued by a command structure that was, despite official language of holding the fortress indefinitely, clearly preparing for the possibility that Singapore could not be held. Water supplies were being carefully managed. Food supplies were being rationed. Ammunition was being inventoried. These are not the preparations of a command that believes it will hold indefinitely. These are the preparations of a command that is beginning to consider what happens if the fortress falls. It was in this context, in the first week of January 1942, that the question of evacuation began to be seriously discussed. If Singapore fell, what would happen to the soldiers who were defending it? Would they be able to withdraw? Would there be a way to evacuate forces before Japanese forces closed the perimeter? Could supplies, equipment, or personnel be shipped out to prevent them falling into Japanese hands? These were not idle questions. They were practical questions being asked by commanders who understood that the strategic situation was deteriorating and that contingency planning for defeat was now necessary. And the answer to these questions, as events would reveal, was complex and contradictory, and ultimately determined by London as much as by commanders on the ground. The British military command in Singapore and the civil government of Singapore had different concerns. Military commanders were thinking about how to preserve fighting forces and continue operations elsewhere. The civil government was thinking about maintaining order and preventing the kind of panic and collapse that could come if it became public knowledge that the fortress might actually fall. These two concerns pulled in different directions. The military wanted to prepare for withdrawal and evacuation. The government wanted to maintain the appearance of stability and confidence in the fortress. These two objectives could not be reconciled, and in the gap between them, decisions were made that would shape the rest of the crisis. By the second week of January, Japanese forces were in position to begin their assault. Artillery had been moved into place on the mainland. Assault forces had been concentrated. Supplies had been stockpiled. The Japanese commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had achieved the objective of moving his forces from Thailand to the gates of Singapore in approximately 5 weeks. The advance down Malaya had consumed virtually all the military resources Britain could assemble in the Far East. The fortress that had been designed to hold while reinforcements arrived discovered that no reinforcements were coming. The only reinforcements that had arrived were the Australian troops that were now about to be tested in conditions they had not been trained for, and in a situation that had been created months before they set foot in Singapore. The assault on Singapore began in the second week of February 1942. Japanese forces crossed the Strait of Johor on improvised vessels and began the assault on the fortress perimeter. The fighting that followed was intense and confused, exactly the kind of close-quarters combat that occurs when defensive positions are not designed for the terrain from which the attack comes. Australian troops fought, British troops fought, Indian troops fought. The position was attacked and counterattacked. Units moved to threatened sectors of the perimeter. Units that had held positions fell back to new positions. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clear to every soldier who was present. The fortress was not designed for this kind of attack. The guns were pointed in the wrong direction. The defensive positions were oriented toward a threat that was no longer coming, and the attacking force was larger and more experienced than had been anticipated. What happened next would become the central question in the Australian understanding of the fall of Singapore. As the tactical situation deteriorated, as it became clear that the fortress could not hold, as supplies began to run short and water supplies became critical, the question of evacuation became urgent. But evacuation to where? Evacuation by what means? And under whose orders? The Strait of Johor was dominated by Japanese forces. Singapore Harbor was under Japanese air attack. The island was increasingly surrounded, and the command structure, which had planned for holding indefinitely, was now struggling to develop a plan for anything else. It was in this moment of maximum confusion and maximum pressure that Major General Henry Gordon Bennett made the decision that would define the rest of his life. As the fortress fell, as the perimeter was compressed, as the fighting became increasingly desperate, Bennett understood that evacuation was the only rational choice. He began to make arrangements to evacuate key personnel, supplies, and as many troops as could be moved. He organized small boats and vessels to attempt to break out of Singapore Harbor and reach the southern islands and eventually Australia. He gave orders that prioritized certain personnel and certain units, and he participated in the command decision to surrender the fortress. The surrender of Singapore, when it came in the middle of February 1942, was technically a British decision. The overall commander was British. The authority to surrender was British, but it was a decision that encompassed all the forces in the garrison, including the Australian troops. Approximately 85,000 soldiers, a mix of British, Australian, Indian, and other troops, were ordered to lay down their weapons and march into captivity. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen in less than 2 weeks of serious assault. What happened in the hours and days immediately after the surrender is where the story becomes more complex than simple military defeat. The command structure did not cease to function the moment the fortress fell. Orders continued to be issued, decisions continued to be made, and among those decisions was the question of what would happen to the senior officers and commanders. Would they remain with their troops and march into captivity, or would they attempt to escape and continue the war elsewhere? Bennett made the choice to escape. In the chaos of the surrender and the occupation that followed, he arranged passage on a small vessel that was attempting to break out of the harbor. He left Singapore with a small group of officers and staff. He reached the southern islands. He eventually made his way to Australia. He survived the war and spent the rest of his life defending the decisions he had made in Singapore. What he left behind were 15,000 Australian soldiers, now prisoners of war, who would face the next 3.5 years in Japanese captivity. What they faced in those camps, the conditions they endured, the losses they sustained, became part of the collective Australian understanding of the war. But the question that haunted the return of these men to Australia, and the question that shaped Australian military culture for decades, was, why did the general escape while the soldiers marched into captivity? Why was the command structure preserved while the rank and file paid the price? The facts of what happened at Singapore are clear. A fortress designed for one kind of attack faced a different kind of attack. The fortress fell because it was fundamentally miscalculated. The garrison fell because it was overwhelmed and lacked the capacity to hold. The soldiers were captured because they were ordered to surrender by the authority that still retained command power. But the meaning of these facts, the significance of these events, and the lessons that should be drawn from them became contested almost immediately after the war ended. Bennett's escape from Singapore became controversial almost immediately. He had left as a commander. He had returned to Australia and attempted to maintain authority and reputation. But the soldiers who came back from Japanese captivity years later had their own understanding of what had happened. They had been marched into a trap. They had been ordered to hold positions that could not be held. They had been commanded by a structure that had fundamentally miscalculated. And when the moment came to escape, the command structure had escaped while they had remained to face captivity. The official Australian narrative tried to present the fall of Singapore as a shared tragedy, a defeat that all participants had endured together. But that narrative could not quite hold because the reality was more complex. The soldiers had endured captivity. The general had escaped. The command structure had failed. And the question of responsibility for that failure and for the decisions that had led to the catastrophe was not clearly addressed in the official narratives that emerged in the immediate post-war period. What makes the fall of Singapore historically significant is not simply that a fortress fell or that soldiers were captured. Those things happen in wars. What makes it significant is that it represents a moment when an entire strategic doctrine, an entire set of assumptions about geography and technology and military power, was revealed as fundamentally wrong. And the consequences of that wrongness were borne not by the people who made the strategic decisions, but by the soldiers who had been positioned according to those assumptions. The British military planners who designed Singapore as a fortress pointing south were not punished for their miscalculation. They were not court-martialed or dismissed. They faced no significant consequences. The commanders who had predicted that Singapore could hold indefinitely were not held accountable. The government that had promised protection was not changed. The consequences were borne by 15,000 young men who had no role in making the strategic decisions that shaped their fate. This is the pattern that the fall of Singapore reveals. Military strategy is made by people who will not bear the consequences of their mistakes. Soldiers bear the consequences, and the question of why this pattern persists and how it is justified, and what it means for the relationship between command and those who are commanded became central to Australian military thinking in the decades after the war. The escape of Major General Henry Gordon Bennett became the symbolic focus of this resentment. It was not technically unusual. Officers sometimes did escape from camps and captivity. It was not technically against orders or regulations. The command had, in some sense, authorized escape attempts by senior officers who might be able to rejoin the war effort elsewhere. But it was, symbolically, the moment when the gap between command and soldiers was made most visible. The man who had given the orders to hold was no longer there to answer for those orders. The men who had obeyed the orders to hold were now prisoners of war. In the years after the war, Bennett lived in Australia and attempted to justify his decisions and his escape. He argued that he had stayed as long as it was tactically reasonable to do so. He argued that his escape was necessary so that he could continue the war effort. He argued that the fall of Singapore was inevitable, given the strategic situation. He wrote memoirs. He gave interviews. He participated in official inquiries into how Singapore had fallen. And throughout these attempts to reconstruct and justify his role, he was persistently confronted with the fact that he had escaped while his soldiers had not. The court inquiries into the fall of Singapore attempted to establish what had happened and why. They examined the strategic calculations. They examined the tactical decisions. They examined the movement of forces and the placement of guns and the timing of the assault. And in the course of these examinations, they produced an historical record that was, in many respects, at odds with the official narrative that Singapore had simply been overwhelmed by a superior force. What the inquiries revealed was more complex and more damning than simple military defeat. They revealed that the fortress had been designed with assumptions that did not match military reality. They revealed that senior commanders had been warned that the assumptions might be wrong. They revealed that contingency planning for defeat had been inadequate. They revealed that the evacuation of civilian population and supplies had been chaotic and incomplete. They revealed that the command structure had given contradictory orders as the situation deteriorated. And they revealed that the decision to surrender had been made when supplies were still available and when the fortress had not been completely overrun. The question that emerged from these inquiries was not quite, why did Singapore fall? Because the answer to that was clear. It fell because it was attacked by a more capable force that employed tactics that the fortress had not been designed to resist. The question that emerged was more troubling. Why did the fall happen the way it did? Why was evacuation so chaotic? Why were contingency plans inadequate? Why were contradictory orders being issued? Why did the surrender come when it did? Why did the command structure that had planned for indefinite resistance suddenly decide that resistance was no longer possible? The answers to these questions pointed to something deeper than simple tactical failure. They pointed to a command structure that had lost contact with reality. They pointed to planners who had bet the security of the fortress on assumptions that were not tested against military reality. They pointed to commanders who were transmitting orders based on doctrine rather than on the situation that was actually developing. And they pointed to a gap between what was planned and what was actually possible. This gap between plan and reality is the central subject of the fall of Singapore. The fortress was supposed to be impregnable. That plan was wrong. The assault was supposed to come from the south. That plan was wrong. The fortress was supposed to hold indefinitely while reinforcements arrived. That plan was wrong. The soldiers were supposed to be defending a fortress that could actually hold. That assumption was wrong. And when all of these wrong assumptions encountered military reality, the results were catastrophic. What happened to the 15,000 Australian soldiers who remained in Singapore after the surrender reveals the human costs of strategic miscalculation. They became prisoners of war. They were marched into captivity. They were held in camps in Singapore and later moved to camps in Thailand and Malaya and other locations throughout the Japanese occupation zone. They endured conditions that were brutal and inadequate. They sustained losses through disease, malnutrition, and the systematic abuse of prisoners by their captors. They remained in captivity for 3.5 years until the war ended. The records of what happened in these camps are detailed and distressing. They document not only the actions of the Japanese guards and administrators, but also the attempts by the prisoners themselves to maintain order, support each other, and preserve enough of their humanity to survive the experience. They document the leadership that emerged among the officers and non-commissioned officers. They document the medical care that was attempted with minimal supplies. They document the deaths that occurred and the losses that were sustained. And they document the psychological strain of captivity, of uncertainty about whether the war would ever end, of separation from home and family, of the knowledge that the war was being fought elsewhere without them. What these records do not primarily document is rage. There are, in many of the accounts, references to anger at the Japanese captors and administrators. But there are also, and perhaps more prominently, references to anger at the command structure that had brought them to Singapore, at the strategic assumptions that had shaped the fortress, at the decisions that had been made in the weeks before the assault that had not prepared them for what they faced. The soldiers understood, even in captivity, that they were prisoners not only of the Japanese, but of the consequences of decisions that had been made months before they arrived in Singapore. One soldier who became something of a symbol for this generation of Australian prisoners was a young private from rural Australia named Frank Cowan. Cowan had been drafted into the Australian Army in 1940 and had served in various units before arriving in Singapore in 1941. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary soldier. He was not decorated for bravery. He was not noticed for exceptional leadership. He was simply a young man who had been sent to Singapore to reinforce the fortress and had ended up a prisoner of war. Cowan survived the war. He came back to Australia, and in the decades after the war, he participated in various veterans organizations and gave testimony about what the fall of Singapore had meant. In his accounts, which were recorded in oral histories and in interviews with journalists and historians, Cowan made clear that the fall of Singapore was not, in his understanding, a tragedy of overwhelming enemy force or of brave soldiers being beaten down by superior numbers. It was, in his understanding, a tragedy of miscalculation and failed planning. It was a tragedy where soldiers had been put into positions that had been designed by people who had not adequately anticipated what those positions would face. Cowan's testimony and the testimony of thousands like him shaped the post-war understanding of Singapore in Australia. It was not the official narrative that Singapore had simply fallen to a superior Japanese force. It was a more complex understanding that Singapore had fallen because it had been miscalculated, because the command structure had failed to adapt to changing circumstances, and because the soldiers had been the ones who paid the price for these failures. The official response to the fall of Singapore in the weeks and months immediately after it occurred was shaped by the political necessity of maintaining morale and public confidence in the war effort. The Australian government could not admit that the fortress it had been confidently reinforcing had fallen because of fundamental miscalculation. It could not admit that strategic doctrine had proven wrong. It could not admit that the command structure had given orders that did not match military reality. Instead, the official narrative presented Singapore as a fortress that had been heroically defended and that had eventually fallen to overwhelming enemy force. This narrative was not exactly false. Singapore had been defended and it had faced a significant enemy force, but it was incomplete. It did not capture the complexity of the situation. It did not address the question of why the defense had failed so rapidly. It did not examine the decisions that had been made before and during the assault. It did not acknowledge the gap between plan and reality. The British military command in particular had a strong interest in presenting Singapore in a certain way. The fortress had been designed by British military planners. It had been commanded by British officers, and its fall reflected on British military competence and British strategic thinking. If Singapore had simply been overwhelmed by a superior force, then the fall could be attributed to the enemy's strength rather than to British miscalculation. This was a politically useful narrative. But even as the official narrative was being constructed, evidence was accumulating that suggested the reality was more complex. Officers and soldiers who had participated in the defense of Singapore were being interrogated and giving accounts of what had happened. Military planners were examining the tactical situation and asking how the advance down Malaya had moved so rapidly. Intelligence analysts were studying Japanese tactics and trying to understand how they had achieved such success. And out of this examination came a picture of the fall of Singapore that was at odds with the official narrative. What emerged was that the fall of Singapore was not the result of overwhelming enemy force. It was the result of a command structure that had miscalculated the nature of the threat and had positioned forces in a way that made them vulnerable to that threat. Japanese forces had advanced down Malaya at a speed that British military planners had not anticipated. Japanese tactics of attacking through terrain considered impassable had not been adequately prepared for. The fortress itself had been designed with the assumption that the primary threat would come from the sea, not from the land. And when the primary threat came from the land, the fortress had proven inadequate. Moreover, what emerged from the detailed examination of the fall was that the fortress could have held longer. There was still ammunition. There were still supplies. There were still water supplies available. The defensive positions, while not ideal for the direction from which the attack came, were not indefensible. The assault, while intense, had not completely broken the garrison, and yet the decision to surrender was made. The question of why that decision was made became central to the post-war understanding of what had happened. The official justification for the surrender was that water supplies were running critically low. If the garrison had fought on, the argument went, the soldiers would have run out of water and the fortress would have fallen anyway, but in conditions of even greater suffering. Therefore, the command made the decision to surrender in order to preserve the lives of the soldiers by ending the fighting while water was still available and order could still be maintained. This justification is not entirely false. Water was, indeed, a concern, but the question that emerged from detailed examination was whether water had actually run out, or whether there were still sufficient supplies to continue the fight. Some accounts suggested that water supplies were more adequate than the official narrative suggested. Some accounts suggested that the decision to surrender was made not because water was actually critical, but because it was believed water would become critical if the fighting continued. This distinction between actual scarcity and anticipated scarcity matters because it goes to the question of whether other alternatives were genuinely unavailable or whether they were simply not pursued. The question of why Major General Henry Gordon Bennett escaped became increasingly central to the post-war understanding. It was not that his escape was unusual or that there were regulations against it. The question was more subtle. It was, at what point did Bennett decide that resistance was no longer possible? And was that decision made too early? Did Bennett surrender the fortress because resistance was genuinely impossible? Or did he surrender it because he had decided that resistance was no longer worth the cost in lives? And if he had made that decision, why did he then escape while ordering the soldiers to march into captivity? The answer to this question is not clear from the historical record because Bennett himself never fully explained it. He gave accounts of his decision-making. He testified about his reasoning, but he did not, in any of those accounts, adequately address the specific moment at which he decided that resistance was no longer possible. He did not explain why that moment came when it did, or whether it could have been delayed, or whether other alternatives had been genuinely exhausted. What we know is that Bennett was under enormous pressure. He was the senior Australian officer in a collapsing fortress. He was receiving orders from higher command that were contradictory and sometimes nonsensical. He was watching soldiers under his command being killed and wounded. He was dealing with the chaos of a military collapse that was happening faster than anyone had anticipated, and he was making decisions in real time that had to be made despite the fact that the situation was changing rapidly and information was often incomplete. In this context, the decision to surrender was not obviously wrong. It was a decision that a commander could make, and that many commanders have made when the situation has deteriorated beyond the point where resistance seems likely to succeed. But what made Bennett's decision controversial was not that he made it, but that, having made it, he then escaped. The soldiers remained to face the consequences of the decision. The general left to avoid those consequences. The question of responsibility for the fall of Singapore occupied military planners and politicians throughout the war and in the years after the war. Official inquiries were launched. Reports were written. Testimony was gathered. And what emerged from all of this examination was that the fall of Singapore was not the fault of any single person or any single decision. It was the result of a series of decisions and assumptions that, taken together, had created a situation in which the fortress was vulnerable to the kind of attack that Japan had mounted. The most fundamental assumption was that invasion would come from the sea. This assumption was made by planners who were experienced and competent. It was not obviously wrong at the time it was made, but it proved to be wrong when tested against military reality. The planners had not adequately considered that Japanese forces operating in China and dealing with difficult terrain had developed the capacity to move rapidly through terrain that Europeans considered impassable. The second assumption was that the fortress could hold indefinitely while reinforcements arrived. This assumption was based on the belief that Britain could assemble sufficient additional forces to reinforce Singapore if the Japanese attacked. This assumption proved to be wrong because Britain was fighting Germany and had no additional forces available. Australia could send more soldiers, but more soldiers would simply increase the number of prisoners if the fortress fell. Reinforcements that could actually affect the outcome were not available. The third assumption was that the command structure in Singapore could adapt to changing circumstances. This assumption proved to be partly wrong because the command structure in Singapore was subordinate to command structures in London that were operating on the assumptions that had proved wrong. Orders from London continued to assume that Singapore could hold indefinitely and that the primary threat came from the sea. These orders did not match the situation that was developing on the ground. The fourth and perhaps most fundamental assumption was that a fortress, by definition, could hold. That if you had a fortress with guns and supplies and soldiers, the fortress would hold. This assumption reflected British military doctrine and British historical experience. Fortresses, in the European tradition, had held against assault. But Singapore was not a fortress in the European tradition. It was an island fortress designed for a kind of warfare that was not the kind of warfare the Japanese employed. These assumptions, taken together, created a situation in which 15,000 Australian soldiers were positioned in a location that was not defensible in the way they had been told it was defensible. And when that location came under assault, the assault was of a kind that the fortress had not been designed to resist. The result was the rapid fall of the fortress and the capture of the garrison. What happened after the fall reveals the moral and institutional consequences of strategic miscalculation. The soldiers who were captured faced years of captivity, disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Many of them did not survive. Those who did survive returned to Australia profoundly affected by their experience. They carried with them not only the trauma of captivity, but also the knowledge that they had been positioned in the fortress based on strategic assumptions that had proved wrong. The question of who was responsible for these consequences was not clearly answered. Planners were not court-martialed. Commanders were not dismissed. The government that had made the strategic decisions was not changed. The assumption seemed to be that military defeat is an acceptable outcome of strategic miscalculation, even when the consequence is the loss of thousands of soldiers. But in Australia, the assumption was different. In Australia, there was a persistent belief that someone should have been held responsible. Someone should have been court-martialed for the miscalculation. Someone should have faced consequences. This belief was not resolved by official inquiries or official reports. It shaped the post-war relationship between the soldiers and the command structure. The question of Major General Henry Gordon Bennett became the symbol of this unresolved issue. In the decades after the war, Bennett lived in Australia. He participated in veterans organizations. He wrote about his experiences. He defended his decisions, and he was persistently confronted by soldiers who had been in Singapore with the question of why he had escaped while they had remained to face captivity. This question was never fully answered to the satisfaction of the soldiers who asked it. Bennett died in the 1960s. By that time, the survivors of Singapore captivity were returning to normal life in Australia. Many of them were traumatized. Many of them struggled to find employment. Many of them never fully recovered from the experience of captivity. And the question of what had gone wrong and who had been responsible remained unanswered in any formal sense. It is in this context that the significance of Singapore becomes clear. Singapore matters not because it was a military defeat. It matters because it represents a moment when a command structure failed, when strategic doctrine proved inadequate to the situation it faced, and when the consequences of that failure were borne by soldiers who had no role in making the strategic decisions. In the decades after the war, the Australian military did attempt to draw lessons from the fall of Singapore. One lesson was that fortresses could not be held indefinitely without reinforcement. Another lesson was that strategic doctrine had to be tested against the actual intentions and capabilities of enemies, not against assumptions about what enemies would logically do. Another lesson was that command structures had to maintain flexibility and adapt to changing circumstances rather than continuing to execute plans that no longer made sense. But the deepest lesson of Singapore was about the relationship between command and those who are commanded. Singapore revealed that soldiers are positioned by strategic decisions that are made by people who will not bear the consequences of those decisions. It revealed that fortresses can fail, that command structures can miscalculate, and that strategies can prove inadequate to the situations they face. And it revealed that when these failures occur, the consequences are borne not by the decision makers, but by the soldiers. This understanding shaped Australian military thinking in the decades after the war. There was a persistent skepticism toward strategic doctrine that promised impossibly high levels of security. There was a persistent belief that fortresses could fall, and that assumptions about what was impossible needed to be tested against reality. There was a persistent understanding that the relationship between command and soldiers was not one in which command could make strategic decisions with the confidence that those decisions would work out. But what was not resolved was the question of accountability. If a command structure had miscalculated so badly that it had positioned soldiers in an indefensible location, what consequences should that command structure face? If strategic doctrine had proved inadequate, who was responsible for developing doctrine that was more adequate? If assumptions about what was impossible had proved to be assumptions that could be violated, who was responsible for testing those assumptions before the test was forced by military defeat? These questions became the unanswered questions of Singapore. They shaped the way Singapore was remembered and understood. They influenced the way Australian military leaders thought about strategy and command in the decades that followed. And they revealed something fundamental about the relationship between military authority and those who are subject to that authority. The fall of Singapore also revealed something about the nature of military empires. Britain had presented itself as the guarantor of security in the Far East. Britain had assured Australia that if it positioned forces in Singapore, those forces would be protected by the might of the British Empire. And then the fortress fell, and the protection did not materialize, and the soldiers who had been assured that they would be secure found themselves prisoners of war. This revelation about the limitations of empire was perhaps the most politically significant consequence of the fall of Singapore. It contributed to a shift in Australian thinking about independence and self-determination. If Australia could not rely on the protection of the British Empire, then Australia had to develop the capacity to defend itself. This understanding contributed to the post-war reshaping of Australian strategy and to the gradual emergence of an independent Australian military policy. But that is a longer story than the story of Singapore itself. The immediate legacy of Singapore was the experience of 15,000 soldiers who came back to Australia profoundly affected by their experience of captivity and defeat. The immediate legacy was the understanding that fortresses could fall, that strategic doctrine could be wrong, and that consequences of that wrongness would be borne by soldiers. In the years after the war, as the survivors of Singapore captivity returned to normal life, the story of Singapore gradually became a subject of historical examination. Historians began to study what had happened. Military analysts began to examine the tactical and strategic decisions. Journalists interviewed survivors and recorded their experiences. And gradually, a historical picture emerged that was more complex and more nuanced than either the official narrative or the soldiers' immediate understanding. What historians discovered was that the fall of Singapore was not a simple case of overwhelming enemy force defeating brave defenders. It was a case of strategic miscalculation leading to tactical defeat. It was a case of a command structure that had planned for one kind of war, encountering a different kind of war. It was a case of a fortress designed for one kind of threat facing a different threat. It was a case of orders from higher command contradicting the situation on the ground. Moreover, what historians discovered was that the fall of Singapore was not inevitable. It had been made to seem inevitable by strategic planners who had committed all available forces to the defense of the fortress, and then found that the fortress could not hold. But if different strategic decisions had been made earlier, if reinforcements had been positioned differently, if the fortress had been designed differently, if the advance down Malaya had been defended differently, the outcome could have been different. But it was not different. The choices that had been made had been made. The fortress had fallen, the soldiers had been captured, and the consequences of those decisions would be borne by the prisoners for the next 3.5 years. One of the reasons Singapore remains historically significant is that it reveals the human cost of strategic miscalculation. It is easy, in retrospect, to analyze the decisions that led to the fall and to identify the moments at which different choices could have been made. It is harder to live with the consequences of those decisions. The prisoners of Singapore lived with those consequences. They lived in camps where supplies were inadequate. They lived under guards who sometimes treated them with brutality. They lived with the knowledge that the war was being fought without them, that their families did not know if they were alive or dead, that the world outside the camps had moved on while time inside the camps stood still. Some of them did not survive. Disease claimed many. Malnutrition claimed many. The brutal conditions claimed many. Those who survived returned to Australia changed. They had lived through something that civilians could not fully understand. They had been prisoners, which meant they had lost the capacity to make decisions about their own lives. They had been in the hands of an enemy that had power over them. They had endured conditions that tested the limits of human resilience. When they returned to Australia after the war, they found themselves in a strange position. They were heroes in some respects, survivors who had endured imprisonment and returned. But they were also living reminders of defeat, of miscalculation, of the failure of the fortress and the command structure that had promised the fortress could hold. The questions they asked about why they had been positioned in Singapore, about why the fortress had fallen so quickly, about why the command had made the decisions it had made, were not fully answered. Official inquiries examined the questions, but did not fully resolve them. The command structure defended its decisions, but could not fully explain them. And gradually, over the decades, the questions became less about demanding accountability and more about understanding what had happened and why. This process of understanding took decades. As survivors wrote memoirs, as historians examined the records, as veterans gave testimony, a picture gradually emerged of what Singapore had been. It was a fortress that had been designed on assumptions that proved wrong. It was a garrison that had fought with courage and determination, but had been positioned in a location that could not ultimately be held. It was a command structure that had made decisions based on information that did not match military reality. And it was a group of soldiers who had paid the price for decisions that had been made before they arrived. The question that remained, even after all the historical examination and all the survivor testimony, was a simple one. Could Singapore have held if different decisions had been made? The answer is probably yes. If the fortress had been designed for defense from the land as well as from the sea, if reinforcements that were adequate to the actual threat had been available, if the command structure had adapted more quickly to the changing circumstances, Singapore could have held longer or possibly held indefinitely. But those conditions did not obtain. The fortress was designed for a threat that did not materialize. Reinforcements that could actually affect the outcome were not available. The command structure was slow to adapt, and the result was the rapid fall of the fortress and the capture of the garrison. What Singapore teaches to any military force or any government considering how to defend a territory is that the assumptions on which defense is based must be constantly tested against reality. It teaches that fortresses can fall. It teaches that strategic doctrine can be wrong. It teaches that the consequences of miscalculation are borne not by those who make the decisions, but by those who have to live with the results. But what Singapore teaches most clearly is that there is a relationship between those who command and those who are commanded, and that relationship is based on a kind of implicit contract. The command promises to make decisions based on the best available information and the best judgment that command can bring to bear. The soldiers promise to obey those decisions and to implement them to the best of their ability. When that contract is broken, when the command makes decisions based on miscalculation or inadequate information, the consequences fall on the soldiers. The fall of Singapore revealed that this contract had been broken. The command had made decisions based on assumptions that did not match reality. The soldiers had obeyed those decisions and had paid the price. And the question of how that relationship could be repaired, how trust in the command structure could be restored, how such miscalculation could be prevented in the future, became the central question that Singapore left unanswered. In the decades that followed, the Australian military did attempt to address some of these questions. Doctrine was revised, training was improved, command structures were reformed, the lessons of Singapore were studied and incorporated into military thinking. But the fundamental reality that Singapore had revealed could not be fully addressed, that military authority makes decisions that have profound consequences for those subject to that authority, and that when those decisions are wrong, the consequences are borne by soldiers, not by commanders. This remains the legacy of Singapore. It remains the reason that the story of 15,000 Australians trapped in a fortress that could not hold continues to matter. It is not a story about heroism or about military triumph. It is a story about the consequences of miscalculation. It is a story about the gap between what was promised and what was possible. It is a story about soldiers who trusted in authority and who paid the price when that authority miscalculated. The men who came back from Singapore captivity were changed by the experience. Many of them struggled with what they had endured. Many of them struggled with the knowledge that they had been positioned in Singapore based on assumptions that had proved wrong. Many of them struggled with the absence of clear accountability for the decisions that had led to their captivity. But what they also carried back with them was a clearer understanding of the actual nature of military service and military authority. They understood that authority could be wrong. They understood that the assurances given by command could be based on miscalculation. They understood that the consequences of those miscalculations would be borne by soldiers. And they understood that the relationship between command and those who are commanded was more complex and more precarious than official narratives suggested. This understanding influenced Australian military thinking and Australian political thinking in the post-war years. It contributed to a skepticism toward military authority that was not cynicism but realism. It contributed to an understanding that military power, while important, was not unlimited. It contributed to an understanding that the defense of Australia required more than faith in fortresses and strategic doctrine. It required constant vigilance, constant testing of assumptions, and constant awareness that military authority, like all authority, could miscalculate. The fall of Singapore also influenced how Australia understood its place in the world. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen. The British Empire that was supposed to provide protection had not been able to provide it, and Australia understood that it could not rely on the distant protection of empires. It had to develop the capacity to defend itself. This understanding shaped post-war Australian strategy and contributed to the gradual emergence of Australian independence in military and strategic matters. But the most immediate and most profound legacy of Singapore was the experience of the soldiers themselves. 15,000 young men had been sent to a fortress. A command structure had told them that the fortress was impregnable. They had arrived and found that the fortress had been designed on incorrect assumptions. They had watched it fall. They had been ordered to surrender, and they had spent the next 3.5 years as prisoners of war, living with the knowledge that they had been positioned in a place that could not be defended. When they returned to Australia, they carried that knowledge with them. It changed how they understood military authority. It changed how they understood the relationship between those who command and those who are commanded. It changed how they understood what military service meant. And through their testimony and their experience, it changed how Australia understood the fall of Singapore. The story of Singapore is not a story that ends with the surrender in 1942. It is a story that extends through the decades of captivity and through the post-war decades of attempting to understand what had happened and why. It is a story that continues in the historical examination and in the survivor testimony. And it continues in the lessons that military forces draw from what happened at Singapore. The most important lesson is simple. Fortresses can fall. Assumptions can be wrong. Strategic doctrine can prove inadequate to the situations it faces, and when those things happen, the consequences are borne by soldiers. This lesson shapes how military forces think about defense and how they think about strategy. It is a lesson learned at considerable cost, and it remains relevant to any military force that is attempting to defend a position based on assumptions about what is possible and what is impossible. The soldiers who survived Singapore captivity lived with this knowledge for the rest of their lives. It shaped how they understood authority. It shaped how they understood sacrifice. It shaped how they understood the relationship between those who command and those who obey. And it is this human understanding, born from the experience of thousands of soldiers, that remains the deepest legacy of Singapore